Have you ever looked at a world map and wondered how all those borders actually got there? Well, today we're not just looking at history as a bunch of random, isolated events. No, we're going to look at it like a giant, intricate line of falling dominoes. We're talking over 4,000 years of interconnected history, where a choice made by an ancient king or a battle over some land in North America literally triggered massive chain reactions across the entire globe, eventually drawing the exact borders of the world we live in today.
So here's our roadmap for this historical speedrun. We're going to trace the roots of empire, sail right into the age of exploration, witness Britain becoming a total global juggernaut, track the massive American expansion, and finally see how all of this momentum violently collided in the race to war.
Okay, part 1, the roots of empire. Let's rewind way back to the ancient foundations of civilization, moving from small, isolated city-states to the world's very first conquerors.
Picture ancient Mesopotamia. You've got this ruler, Sargon of Akkad, looking around at all these independent little cities, and he basically decides, you know what, this is way too inefficient. Sargon realized that conquering his neighbors was a fantastic shortcut to building power. He actually came right out and said that kings shouldn't just rule to help their people, they should rule to boost their own pride, power, and possessions. So he conquered his neighbors, built the first empire, and boom, set a violent, expanding template that guys like Alexander the Great and the Romans would totally copy later on.
Now, let's jump over to Britain to see how this empire-building thing compounds. Before Britain was the biggest empire in history, they were basically just a tiny island getting conquered by, well, absolutely everyone. About 2,000 years ago, the Romans showed up and crashed on their couch for a while. Fast forward 1,000 years, you've got Vikings rolling in, taking everyone's stuff, and settling down in England and Normandy. And then, in 1066, those very same Vikings who settled in Normandy, the Normans, crossed the Channel and just conquered England entirely. So the British weren't born global bosses, right? They literally learned the brutal rules of conquest by getting conquered over and over again. Moving on to part 2, the age of exploration. Fast forward to the 1400s. This is the era where global paths finally crossed, and our historical domino effect truly goes worldwide.
This next massive phase of global expansion was essentially split right down the middle by Spain and Portugal, who had completely different but, honestly, highly effective strategies. Portugal was clever. They figured out they could sail all the way around Africa to completely bypass the ancient Silk Road, which let them build a massive spice trading empire over in Asia. Spain, on the other hand, decided to sail straight west. They conquered native populations and extracted just mind-boggling amounts of gold and silver from the Americas. And to avoid a massive war over all this new territory, Spain and Portugal literally just drew a line down the middle of the map. They just agreed to split the entire non-Christian world between the two of them. Wild, right?
But here's where a rather pivotal accident happens. Christopher Columbus didn't actually find those Asian spices he was looking for when he sailed west. He had to go back to the King and Queen of Spain and basically say, no spices. But he did find gold, and that discovery completely derailed the timeline. That gold fueled Spain's massive, violent way of conquest across the Americas. It wiped out entire empires like the Incas and the Aztecs and permanently flipped the global balance of power. Which brings us to part 3, Britain's global juggernaut. England eventually caught up in this intense global race, and believe it or not, it was heavily influenced by some very messy royal drama. So England really starts making waves when King Henry VIII wants a divorce, breaks away from the Pope, and turns the whole country Protestant. Later, his daughter Queen Elizabeth I gets super crafty and literally hires pirates to rob those wealthy Spanish ships we just talked about. But the real catalyst, the ultimate domino effect in action, happens later. Britain gets into a massive fight with France over North American land, known as the French and Indian War. Britain wins, sure, but they are left completely broke, severe war debt. To pay it off, King George III decides to heavily tax the American colonies. The colonists predictably say, hey, taxation without representation isn't cool, and boom, that exact disagreement directly triggers the American Revolution.
Now, losing those original 13 colonies was a complete disaster for the British, but they definitely didn't just pack it up and go home. Thanks to the booming steam power of the new Industrial Revolution, they could make things faster and cheaper, but they desperately needed new markets. So what do? They build a second, even more massive empire. They ship their criminals off to establish a colony in Australia. They welcome loyalists who fled the American Revolution up into Canada. And over in India, the British East India Company systematically chips away at declining kingdoms like the Mughals and the Marathas until they basically control the entire subcontinent.
All right, part 4, the American expansion. While the British were busy expanding their second empire into India, the newly formed United States had a totally different problem. a booming population that was literally doubling every 20 years. They needed space, and they needed it fast.
Meanwhile, over in Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte seizes power in France and is busy fighting these massive wars, mostly against Britain. He actually had big dreams for a North American empire, but he needed cash to fund his European campaigns way more urgently. So, in just an unbelievable stroke of geopolitical luck, Napoleon shockingly sells the entire Louisiana territory to America for a measly $15 million. I mean, for that incredibly low price, the US instantly doubled its size overnight. And the dominoes just kept falling. Decades later, after surviving a brutal civil war and abolishing slavery, another massive real estate deal drops right into America's lap. The Tsar of Russia, who really didn't want to get dragged into a conflict over distant lands, offers up Alaska. The US snags this absolutely massive, resource-rich territory for a mere $7 million. Talk about a bargain.
The crazy thing here is that American expansion wasn't just one single strategy. It was a really ruthless, opportunistic mix of everything. They purchased Louisiana and Florida, they annexed the Republic of Texas once American settlers outnumbered the Mexicans living there, they fought a pretty ugly war with Mexico to take its northern territories, they negotiated for Oregon, and when they literally ran out of land on the continent, they just looked to the oceans. They annexed Hawaii for a crucial naval base, and right after the Spanish-American War, they captured Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. That effectively ended the very empire Christopher Columbus had kickstarted centuries earlier. The US rapidly expanded from sea to sea, and then just kept going. Which brings us to our final chapter, Part 5, The Race to War. By the late 1800s, the global map was getting incredibly crowded. Newly united nations like Italy and Germany looked around at the vast empires of Britain, France, and the US and decided, hey, we want to be like the cool kids and have colonies too. And that sparked a frantic, really dangerous rush. This rush became known as the Scramble for Africa. But here's the thing. To justify carving up an entire continent, Europeans leaned on this twisted, self-serving pseudoscience. They pointed to Charles Darwin's theories and claimed, well, Europeans are simply the fittest to survive, so we're destined to rule the world. But come on, using basic survival instincts to determine universal truth? Terrible metric. And worse, this justification completely and intentionally dismissed the highly sophisticated, incredibly wealthy civilizations that were already living there.
Because long before Europeans ever sat down to draw arbitrary lines on a map, the African continent was already entirely claimed and occupied by incredibly powerful empires. We're talking the ancient might of Egypt and Kush, the immense wealth of Mali and Songhai, the master builders of Great Zimbabwe, and the fierce warriors of the Zulu kingdom. The Europeans didn't just discover an empty continent, they actively ignored a complex geopolitical map that already existed just so they could force their own onto it.
And so, the inevitable happened. With the British, the French, the Germans, Americans, Italians, and Russians all rapidly expanding, capturing territories, and extracting resources, they finally hit a massive wall. They literally ran out of blank spaces on the map. The only major territory left that looked even slightly vulnerable was the crumbling Ottoman Empire. The global dominoes had been pushed absolutely as far as they could go. Now, armed with crazy new technologies from the Industrial Revolution, we're talking airplanes, battleships, submarines, telegraphs, these massive global empires were basically locked in a tightly packed room. All this intense competition, all this outward pushing, had nowhere left to go but directly into each other. It set the perfect explosive stage for World War I. Which leaves us with a pretty provocative thought to end on today. If the entire story of human history is this relentless drive to expand, what actually happens to us when the map is finally full? Do we learn to share the space, or do the dominoes just shatter? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the map.